Governments love to tell you they're working for your financial freedom. They talk about stability, growth, opportunity. But if you look closely at history, you'll see something much darker. Governments have always used hidden financial tricks to keep ordinary people broke while consolidating wealth and power for themselves. And the shocking part is that these tricks are not new. They've been recycled for centuries, wrapped in different packaging, sold under new names, but always with the same purpose: to transfer wealth upward and keep the majority dependent. Let's start with the oldest and simplest trick of all: inflation. When a government spends more than it can raise through taxes, it has two options. It can admit the truth and tax its citizens openly, which is politically dangerous, or it can quietly debase the currency, reducing the value of every coin and every note in circulation. Ancient Rome mastered this tactic. In the 3rd century after Christ, emperors facing military expenses began reducing the silver content of the denarius. A coin that once contained nearly pure silver eventually became mostly copper, with just a thin wash of silver on top. The empire pretended nothing had changed, but everyone holding those coins paid the price. Inflation skyrocketed, savings evaporated, and wages couldn't keep up. It was a silent tax on the population, a trick still used today, just with central banks instead of imperial mints. The Middle Ages brought another version of this game: forced loans. Monarchs in England, France, and Spain routinely leaned on wealthy merchants and guilds to lend money to the crown. Of course, these weren't voluntary. Refusal meant fines, confiscation, or worse. Sometimes the crown promised repayment with interest, but repayment often came late, in devalued currency, or never at all. The government maintained its wars and palaces, while merchants had little choice but to surrender their capital. The trick here was coercion disguised as patriotism or duty, and it worked for centuries. By the 17th century, the financial system itself became the trick. When Britain created the Bank of England in 1694, it wasn't out of charity. It was because the government needed money to fight wars with France. Wealthy investors bought government bonds, and in return, the crown guaranteed interest payments funded by taxes. This sounds like a fair deal, but think about who paid those taxes. Ordinary people, through duties on goods like salt, beer, and cloth. The wealthy lent money to the government and earned secure interest. The poor paid higher taxes to fund those interest payments. It was a wealth transfer system dressed up as national finance, and it cemented a pattern still alive today. The safest investments in the world are lending money to governments, and those returns are ultimately guaranteed by the labor and consumption of the masses. Fast forward to the modern world, and the tricks are everywhere. Take deficit spending. Governments run up massive debts, issuing bonds bought by investors, banks, and foreign powers. Politicians tell the public it's for infrastructure, jobs, or social programs, but much of it funnels into defense contractors, corporate subsidies, and bailouts. When repayment time comes, governments don't cut spending at the top. They raise taxes, inflate the currency, or slash social benefits. The trick is that the debt looks like it's for the people, but the burden lands on their shoulders while the profits go to the bondholders. And then there are bailouts. During the 2008 financial meltdown, banks took reckless bets, bundled toxic mortgages into securities, and nearly collapsed the global economy. Who paid for it? Ordinary taxpayers through massive government bailouts. Who profited afterward? The very same banks, which emerged bigger and more concentrated than before. The trick was simple: privatize the gains, socialize the losses, and the public was told this was necessary to save the system. Even the way governments handle pensions and retirement is a sleight of hand. For decades, people in countries like the United States, Britain, and across Europe have paid into government-managed systems, trusting that the money would be there when they retired. But governments often don't actually save that money. They spend it immediately and leave IOUs in its place. The promise is that future taxpayers will cover the cost when the bill comes due. It is essentially a generational Ponzi scheme wrapped in official language. It works until demographics shift, populations age, and suddenly the system is unsustainable. Then the government reforms it, usually by reducing benefits, raising the retirement age, or inflating away the value of payouts. Notice the pattern. At every stage, the trick relies on perception. The public is told inflation is growth, forced loans are duty, national debt is investment, bailouts are stability, and pension cuts are reform. The language masks the reality, a transfer of wealth from the many to the few, from the bottom to the top. And history shows this trick has worked for centuries because most people don't study economic history, don't understand financial systems, and don't see the trap until it's too late. In recent decades, the tricks have only become more sophisticated. Consider quantitative easing, a term most people never even heard of before the 2008 financial crisis. Central banks created trillions of dollars out of thin air, buying government bonds and mortgage-backed securities to stabilize markets. Politicians and bankers reassured the public this was necessary to prevent collapse. And it worked for the financial system. Asset prices soared. Stocks, real estate, and bonds surged in value. But who owns most of those assets? The wealthy. For the average household without large investments, the benefits were minimal, while the downside came in the form of distorted markets and rising living costs. The trick here was that money creation saved the system for those at the top, while fueling inflation and inequality for everyone else. Another modern sleight of hand is stealth taxation. Instead of raising income taxes directly, governments quietly tax through mechanisms like sales taxes, fuel duties, and most of all, inflation. When prices rise faster than wages, the gap is effectively a hidden tax on savings and purchasing power. Governments love inflation because it reduces the real value of their debts, but for citizens, it erodes financial freedom. You may feel richer because your salary is higher in nominal terms, but if your costs outpace your earnings, you are actually losing wealth. This is not a bug of the system. It is the system. Inflation is not simply an accident of economics. It is one of the most consistent tricks governments deploy to shift the burden of their spending onto you without ever admitting it. Then there's regulatory capture. On the surface, regulations are meant to protect the public. Financial rules, safety standards, consumer protections. But time and again, history shows us that powerful industries influence the regulators meant to oversee them. Railroads in the 19th century, oil companies in the 20th, and tech and finance today all have shaped rules in their favor. This is the same dynamic the Peaky Blinders learned in miniature on the streets of Birmingham. Better to own the referee than to fight the game. Governments use regulation as a tool to appear protective, but behind the curtain, the largest corporations carve loopholes that keep competition down and profits flowing. The public sees protection, the insiders see profit. War finance is another old trick in new clothes. During World War I and World War II, governments issued massive amounts of bonds, telling citizens it was their patriotic duty to buy them. People thought they were supporting their nation, which they were. But these bonds also became lucrative, risk-free investments for the wealthy, guaranteed by future taxes. In the 21st century, the pattern remains. Trillions spent on wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were financed through debt, benefiting defense contractors, banks, and bondholders, while ordinary taxpayers shouldered the bill. The trick is that wars are always presented as temporary emergencies, yet the financial burdens last for generations, long after the soldiers have returned home. Governments also weaponize complexity itself as a financial trick. Tax codes thousands of pages long, financial instruments so complicated even professionals struggle to explain them, budgets filled with hidden line items and jargon. All of this creates an environment where ordinary citizens cannot possibly track how money is flowing. Complexity becomes camouflage. When you cannot see the transfer of wealth, you cannot resist it. In ancient Rome, debased coins were a physical sign of the trick. Today, it's balance sheets buried under acronyms and obscure programs. The trick is the same. Make it too complex for the public to follow and the transfer can proceed unnoticed. Why does this matter now? Because the tricks are alive and accelerating. Inflation eats away at your savings. Debt loads grow larger each year. Bailouts remain the reflex of choice whenever markets wobble. Central banks continue to manipulate money supply, while governments pass costs onto the public in forms so indirect most people never connect the dots. The result is a system designed to keep you working harder for less real wealth, while the financial elite grows stronger. The lesson from history is not just that these tricks exist, but that they always return. When Rome debased its coins, citizens suffered. When monarchs forced loans, merchants lost fortunes. When modern states inflate and borrow, households bear the burden. Different ages, same mechanism. And here's the harsh truth. Most people will never escape these tricks because they don't even realize they're being played. They take inflation as natural, taxes as inevitable, and bailouts as acts of mercy. They believe government messaging instead of studying economic history. And that ignorance is the most powerful trick of all. When people forget the past, they cannot recognize its repetition. That is why governments and elites prefer a public uneducated in finance. Financial education is resistance. Economic history is a weapon. If you know the tricks, you're harder to manipulate. So what should you take away? First, always look beyond the headline. When governments announce stimulus, ask who profits first. When inflation rises, remember it is not just bad luck, it is policy. When regulations appear, ask who wrote them and who benefits. Second, build real wealth outside the traps. Assets that can hold value even when currency does not. Third, never assume the system works for you just because it says it does. Systems exist to protect themselves, not you. History doesn't repeat, but if you don't understand it, it will crush you all the same. The financial tricks that kept Roman citizens broke are the same ones draining your bank account today, only dressed in modern language. The only difference is whether you recognize them in time. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers, and I'll show you where to look.